right, it's 11 a.m., so we'll go ahead and get started. Welcome to HDSA and our session on driving. We're very, very excited to have you all here and looking forward to having a great discussion with you as we share what we know. I'm Shelley Knewstep-Watkins. I'm an occupational therapist, and this is my co-presenter, Hope.
Hi, I'm Hope Heller. I'm a social worker. I am at the HDSA Center of Excellence at MedStar Georgetown University Hospital in Washington, D.C. I have been there since we opened the center 5 years ago, and previous to that, I was also working as the chapter social worker in the D.C. metro area. So I've been working with the HD community for about 8 years or so.
As I mentioned, I'm Shelley Knewstep-Watkins, an occupational therapist for the University of Virginia in Charlottesville, Virginia. I've been a part of our HDSA Center of Excellence for about 6 years in my role. In our clinic, we may be a little bit different than some of the other clinics in that we see our patients with HD every 6 to 12 months, and each patient is seen generally by not only the physician, but also a visit with me for occupational therapy, a visit with a physical therapist, a visit with a speech therapist, social worker, and sometimes our psychologist or our genetic counselor. So they're often very busy days, but we do get to see everyone often, which has been a beautiful way for me to learn more and more from our families. Hope and I don't have any financial relationships to disclose with you all today before we start speaking. Our session will very much focus on driving safety. We'll look at the red flags for driving safety, how to have conversations about driver safety, planning for retiring from driving, as well as a large focus on how to collaborate with your medical team and what the driving safety evaluations options are there.
So,
There you go.
hello?
It says
Okay. I did. Can you hear me now? All right. So really quickly before we get started, I just want to let you know this is a live streamed and recorded session. So the camera will be focused on us, but obviously for anyone speaking, it will be recorded, just so people know for privacy purposes. So I just want to start by asking the group, what makes a safe driver?
Please respond. It's more fun if you talk.
Reaction time.
Reaction time.
Okay.
I heard defensive driving. What else?
Awareness. That's a good one.
What else?
Absence of collision.
Yes, we do want that.
How do we get to the absence of collisions?
Great, thank you.
All right.
So anyone can be an unsafe driver by being distracted. There's some pretty common ones up there that I think tempt many of us. Being too tired, maybe trying to grab a quick bite, maybe looking at the cell phone. Anyone can be an unsafe driver when they're being too emotional in the moment. Anyone can be an unsafe driver when they experience physical changes. And that happens for everyone as we age. So it's important that when we start this conversation about driving, to remember everyone will retire from driving. So just to kind of recap, it's anyone can be an unsafe driver when they're not focused on their driving. Anyone can be an unsafe driver when they don't have their emotions in check. Anyone can be an unsafe driver when they're experiencing physical changes, such as loss of vision, that impede their ability to drive. So let's switch gears a little bit and talk about what do you all think are the biggest concerns with safe driving for someone who has HD?
Focus.
Focus.
Okay.
Slower reflexes. Uncontrollable movements.
Gripping the steering wheel.
Great.
Decision making.
Right. Well, I thought we were going to get the more typical answers, but clearly we already have some very knowledgeable people with us. Many people that are newer to HD think that driving safety for a person with HD is mostly related to movement. However, as you all mentioned, there are, with HD, changes in thinking, control of emotions, and physical ability. And so when we're thinking about how HD causes changes in focus or judgment or visual perception, and that's something that I think sometimes doesn't get talked about quite as much as it should, but HD can impact how our mind interprets what our eyes are seeing. And that's a huge component of driving safety. Controlling emotions, and that's not just road rage, but also if there's someone who goes quickly from being happy to sad or to anger, and then the physical abilities that can change with HD of uncontrolled movements, as well as slowed eye movements.
Okay. How many people in here live in a big city or have to travel into a big city pretty regularly? All right, good, a good amount in here. Okay, HD and city driving. This in and of itself can become an issue. I personally live in the DC metro area. I commute into DC every day. We have highways, we have traffic, we have busy roads. Shelley, on the other hand, has back roads and rural
Deer. They're coming from everywhere.
and has country backcountry roads. One of the things that we often hear in our clinic that is a concern is somebody's highway driving or the frustration level that grows with traffic or construction. There's always construction on our highways in DC. So this is often one of the areas. This photo makes me very anxious because I'm a mom. When I got my driver's license when I was a teenager, my mother said, "I taught you to drive. I'm not worried about you. I'm worried about everyone else on the road." And a lot of our patients come to clinic, and when we talk about driving, they talk about that they won't turn on the radio, and they're very focused, and they try to not have distractions, which are all very good things that make you a safe driver. At some point in time within the progression of the disease, there are reflexes and reaction times that become the problem. So it's not you that we're necessarily worried about all the time. It's the child that runs in the street or the driver that cuts you off. And that can happen at any point in time. And when you have Huntington's disease, your eyes have to talk to your brain, which has to talk to your foot. And even a split-second delay in that can cause an issue. So, I'm going to guess most people in here are pretty knowledgeable about Huntington's disease, but in general, we know it can cause changes in thinking, being able to control our emotions, and our physical abilities. And all of these make up the critical parts to being a safe driver. So just some of the themes that we're gonna continue to run through is the first conversation, just how to talk about what driving safety looks like and how to talk about retiring from driving, the yellow flags to look for, driving modifications. So sometimes it's not an immediate, you have to stop driving, a certified driving rehab versus just a DMV evaluation, and then the emotions behind it and what retirement from driving actually looks like. So the first conversations, how to start thinking about modifying driving or retiring from driving. I think the most important part of this as the family member or as the person with HD is first thinking about how do you want those conversations to happen? What do you want those conversations to look like? So some of my patients come into clinic and they're very willing to talk about the future and talk about future things, We often see that somebody's had a family member that they've had a parent or another loved one with the disease that they've been through this with. And so they say, I don't want to do that. I want to just be told and I'll stop. But a lot of people are pretty resistant. They don't want to talk about driving until they absolutely have to. And then even still, they don't want to talk about it. But the earlier we can at least start the conversations, we encourage people as families to do this. How do you want us to talk about it? Who do you want involved in the conversation? I would guess that at most of your doctor's visits, there's going to be a question about driving. I know we ask our patients at pretty much every clinic visit what's going on with driving, and I ask, I know the psychiatrist asks, I know the neurologist asks, so it gets talked about a lot. So it's probably an ongoing discussion in the doctor's office, but how do you want that to look like for you when family starts to notice those yellow flags and things like that? Also, for family to think about why feedback is important. You could say to somebody, no, you have Huntington's disease, it's starting to progress, you shouldn't drive anymore. But we really like to provide people with feedback and understanding and reasons. Independence with driving is a huge part of independence. It's not something we take away from people lightly, and it's not something we want to take away from people until we absolutely have to. So when we do, we want to be able to give them as much details and as many things as we can. I'm also a big fan of involving the medical team in it. Family members, caregivers, loved ones, you guys play the bad guys a lot in terms of when things have to be taken away, when somebody's losing their independence. Let us be the ones to really start that if somebody's having a hard time with that. Let the doctors, let the therapists, let the social workers, let us be the ones to start to say, gosh, everything you're doing, what's going on is starting to sound pretty concerning. Now, the one thing we ask of families is if you're concerned about how the conversation's going to go, if you're concerned about starting the conversation, talk to the doctor's office ahead of time. I have families call me all the time before clinic and say, gosh, I'm really worried about Uncle Jim, or I'm really worried about my husband or my wife, and I know she's resistant to talking about driving, but A, B, and C has happened. We're going to ask about driving anyways. It's good to have the details, and it's good to know how we need to lead those questions. The one thing we ask of families is if the person then says, no, my driving's fine, there's no problem. It's helpful if the family steps in and gives us some indication that there's a problem. If a family says, yeah, no, I agree, we can't go too much further with that, because we do rely on the families to be truthful with us on that part. But again, knowing how those conversations should happen, we want to allow people as much dignity and as much power over their health care and their health care choices for as long as possible. And so starting there and then involving the medical team, but also, again, just starting those conversations early.
All right. So now I'd like to talk a little bit about what we observe to be the 3 most common ways that people approach retiring from driving. The first one is the least preferred, and what we do everything in our power to avoid as the medical team and you all do as caregivers, and that is an incident. That is, the person with HD has been driving too long and an accident happens, there's an injury, or there's a safety report. That is what we try to avoid it as much as possible happening. The two approaches that are more common and the ones that are greatly preferred are either going to a certified driving rehab specialist for a driving evaluation, or I guess I should say or working with the family as a team, the medical team, the family, the person with HD, and coming to that decision and coming to the modifications as a group, as a team decision. Now, I think sometimes the way I present it, it seems like an either or, but really it's an and. It's let's start the conversation, let's plan to see the driving evaluation with the rehab therapist, and then we need to follow through together. I think sometimes it's easy to talk about the negative situations that happen with the decision for driving, but there are many families out there who understand what you were sharing in the beginning, that there are safety issues, and they recognize it, and they do put forth steps, and it's not always a conflict. There are definitely families that go through this without there being conflict. So let's talk a little bit about warning signs. Oh, question?
Yeah.
Please.
When it's regarding an accident, I mean, there's some good days and bad days, so there's always denial. So there's already accidents. You do it after the first or the fifth, or when?
For what I recommend is if we're at a point where there is an accident, let's make every effort to address it as quickly as possible by getting into a certified driving rehab specialist evaluation. We've had instances in our clinic where a patient has an accident, and we recommend that they avoid driving until they get their driving evaluation, and then they can return to driving at that modified level that is safe and appropriate. And it may not be much modification. If they do the full evaluation and they did beautifully and it was a really crummy moment when that accident happened, then we have evidence in the medical record to show that continuing driving is a good and appropriate plan.
How often should you do the visit to rehab specialist? Early, 6 months?
You know, and that's a tough question. I like to have ongoing conversation at our HD clinic about, because as I think all of us know, each person with HD, depending on their presentation, can progress more or less quickly. And so I prefer to do that on a case by case. We do have some people who are doing some form of check-in almost every 6 months at that stage, but we also have some people that are doing their driving check more like every 2 years. It depends on the person, it depends on the presentation, and where they are in their progression. So, great.
Where are the certified driving specialists?
I'm going to tell you a lot more about that.
Okay.
Absolutely.
If, they take the test
Uh-huh.
with the driver's evaluation and they fail that,
Yes.
does that therapist have a legal responsibility to report back to the DMV?
They have an ethical responsibility as a medical professional to do so.
I will say it is pretty state specific. We're going to talk about that in a little bit. Different states have different reporting laws of what can and can't be reported, but generally something like that is going to be reported if we know that somebody is still driving and they failed that.
So for example, in the state I live in, it's not legally required, but the certified driving rehab specialists believe as their professional role that they are ethically obligated to report it. So it does.
In turn, would then rescind their license?
So if upon the certified driving rehab specialist submitting that report, I apologize. For the people who are live streaming, I'll do a better job of repeating the question. For a person who attends a certified driving rehab specialist and they are not successful with that evaluation, the certified driving rehab specialist would report that to the state agency, and then the state agency would have the authority to legally take away the license. Yeah.
There's usually a process that the state agency would then ask for from the driver.
So, as a hint of what's to come, we're going to go into greater detail about the certified driving rehab specialist in just a few moments. But as we're thinking about people who are in some of the earlier stages of symptoms that impact driving, I like to think of it as kind of a warning or a watch. You know, when you're watching the Weather Channel, they say a tornado warning or tornado watch. And there are things that make you go, okay, maybe we need to monitor more closely. And then there are things that you see that you go, okay, I absolutely need to monitor more closely my loved one, or I absolutely need to bring this up in the next HD clinic visit or neurology visit. So some early warning signs would be if the person with HD is having difficulty or stress driving in traffic, following other vehicles too closely waiting too long to slow down. That's the final screech when there's a car in front of them. Having difficulty merging or at intersections, making those decisions. And then emotional volatility. And that's speaking to being able to keep the emotions in check. Not going from 0 to 60 emotionally just because of one frustration. So we'll switch now to the more significant warning signs, which to me are more like the tornado watch type of signs. So have them, as one of our guests was saying, have there been recent tickets or vehicle accidents? Are there an accumulation of dents and scratches on the vehicle? Are you worried about children or grandchildren riding along in the vehicle? Are other adults concerned about riding along in the vehicle for their safety? These are big warning signs that need to be a part of the conversation among family, among the family and the medical team, and brought up to the attention of the medical team. So what do we do when we see these watch and warning signs? We want to reflect back on what our person with HD said how they wanted it to be handled. Sometimes they say they want it to be a family conversation privately first. If so, please do that first. Maybe they say, I really want it to be with the medical professionals first. We'll give a tip off to the medical professionals that you see, get back into the clinic, and have the conversation start there. Regardless of these, the one thing that I always recommend to our patients and families is if you're starting to see the warning or watch signs, you need to have a trusted and respected adult doing a monthly ride-along. Because I'm in the clinic and I have a fair amount of insight on driving safety, but I'm not in the vehicle. So I need someone who the person with HD trusts and respects to be able to share with us as the medical team what's going on and what's the consistency of it. So, thank you. Let's start talking a little bit about modifications. Now this first slide, I think all of us could do with remembering, right? Put the cell phone away. If it's that tempting, turn it off. If it's still tempting, put it in the trunk. It's easy to be distracted. We are all human. Some days I'm very human, and perhaps you are too. Don't smoke while driving. That's another thing that sometimes cigarettes get dropped, and that can result in safety issues. Turning down the music or the radio, turning it off. Avoiding fatigue. That may mean that the person with HD isn't a good safe driver for doing an hour, 2 hour, 3 hour long drive, but they are if they drive for 45 minutes and they get out and walk for 10 or 15 minutes and allow their mind to rest and then regroup and then get back on the road. And then for passengers, I don't know about you, but I have some friends that are really loud and they have a lot to say. And I've been known to say, I'm driving to DC, I can't talk right now because I'm not used to it. That's the same thing. The person with HD having that insight and being able to let their passengers know what their needs are. What's your question?
Well, it's kind of just like a
Comment?
comment.
Yes.
Firstly, my mother, a lot of her medications, they have side effects.
Yes.
People with HD have trouble sleeping, so she takes medicine that helps her sleep. So when she wakes up, she's very groggy and more out of it than usual.
Yes.
So I suggest looking out for when they're waking up or when they're taking their medication, because side effects are a big thing that can cause unsafety driving.
That's a beautiful point. Thank you for sharing that.
It's when my mom drives in the morning, it's you gotta watch out. It's
So what our guest is saying is that in her family, it's very helpful to recognize how the side effects may affect the time of day for driving safety. That her loved one can drive safely at certain times because she's more alert, but other times are less safe because of the grogginess from medications. Thank you for sharing that. I think we're ready for the next slide. Okay, sorry. Driving modifications, the next level of modifications after the ones we all should probably be doing. Maintaining extra space around the vehicle, a bigger bubble of space. Avoiding high speed, which may mean avoiding high speed streets and roads, such as the interstate, avoiding congested traffic. We all know what 5 o'clock rush hour is, so that's not the time to go get the milk and bread from the grocery store. right? Avoiding cruise control. And I will confess, I didn't think of this. I had to be taught this. I thought, well, cruise control, that makes it easier, right? Not for the person with HD. Because cruise control, if any of us have been on the road for a long family trip, you realize that cruise control allows you to check out. We don't want people with HD checking out. So we definitely recommend that people with very early symptoms who are still safe drivers avoid using cruise control. The last is help versus harm. So here's another one. I have patients in our clinic who using the GPS helps them stay tuned in. It helps them remember when to turn. It helps them anticipate what to do. I also have people with HD who they watch their GPS like they're watching TV. So they're not watching the road. That's another one of those conversations. It depends on the person. So we need to talk about it. And here's my favorite. Our clinic has what we refer to as the Huntington's disease parking space. It's not the handicap, by the way. It's the one at the way back of the Walmart parking lot that has about 3 extra spaces of vehicle around it. Because typically someone with very early HD that's still a safe driver has the mobility to be able to get across the parking lot, but they may not have the very acute attention to be able to notice all of those vehicles going in front of the store and all of those people coming from the back of the parking lot. So sometimes the handicap accessible parking space is not the most accessible if you have mild attention and focusing issues.
So just to tag on to what Shelley was talking about, the higher speed roads and the congested traffic, again, I'm in the DC metro area. So one of the things I commonly see in our clinic as an early modification is to suggest that somebody, or to recommend that they no longer drive on the highway or in the city, and that they sort of drive on their neighborhood roads if they have 2 or 3 places, the grocery store, the gym, the pharmacy, that they go to within their neighborhood. We find that oftentimes that can still be safe for a while when maybe highway driving is not. But again, it's all going to be very person specific.
Okay, so driving evaluations. Isn't this confusing sometimes? Whew. There's 2 main ways driving evaluations are done. There is the Department of Motor Vehicles that's run by the state. Some states call it something else. I have a tendency to call it the DMV because that's what we call it in Virginia. And then there are the professionals who are the certified driving rehab specialists. These are connected, but they are not the same. So we'll talk a little bit about the differences now. So driving in government. Our United States Department of Transportation has an agency called the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration. So this is federal. It has a wonderful website information about driving with disabilities. This is great, but they don't hold the authority. The authority lies in the states. So each state has their own agency and their own ways of using processes and their laws for licensing. This website at the bottom is a private organization that has put together a listing of all the different DMVs for types of agencies for states, so if you need help finding your local state agency. So I know I've said this probably 3 times already. It depends on your state. If you are a caregiver or you're someone who's in very, very early stages of HD, get to know your state laws and your state processes. If you're having difficulty, talk to your social worker, talk to your OT, talk to your physician. Most of us are well familiar with our state. I can't tell you about other states as well as I can tell you about my state because there's so many differences. So in Virginia, we have the Virginia Department of Motor Vehicles. So I'll give you a couple examples of laws that we have, but look at your own. So how does our DMV find out there's a problem? Our DMV finds out when there is an accident or there's a ticket issued or the physician reports it or relatives report it. So the DMV isn't hunting down medical records to try to figure out who may have a problem. They're responding to when the problem is brought to their attention. In Virginia, we have a medical review request. Go ahead. In that anyone can bring to the attention of our Virginia DMV that they are concerned about someone else's driving safety. However, and this is one of those things, once again, look at your state. Our state law says that the DMV cannot provide the information of the source if the source is a relative or a licensed medical professional. So in my state, if I think my neighbor's crummy at driving, I can report them. But as soon as that report is filed, they can also ask who reported it, and my neighbor can find out it was me, if that matters in your situation. So be aware. In Virginia, we also, for our when the medical review request is placed, this is the medical review process. Based on our medical board, the person whose driving is that people are concerned about may have to submit a medical or revision statement from a physician. They may have to do a 2-part driving license knowledge exam, so that's computer-based or paper-based. They may be required to do a road skills test with the DMV, and they may be required to go to a certified driving rehab specialist. It depends on the situation as to what in Virginia the DMV decides with their medical board the person would have to do. Likewise, in our state, there are laws, there is a process for cognitive impairment that shows that of those options, it's a little more strict. I'm not gonna go in a whole lot of detail about this, but it gives you an idea that if there's a cognitive issue in this state, what is required, and that it's monitored by the state every 6 to 12 months. So, certified driving rehab specialist. I'm like a fangirl of these OTs because most of the certified driving rehab specialists are occupational therapists. So they are medical professionals trained like myself, but they've gone above and beyond and become trained in driving rehab. And when I've spoken to them, the one thing they want everyone to know is their job is to enable people to drive safely. They're not the bouncer saying no, yes, no. The point of their job is to be there and help and say, when and how can this person drive safely? And when there is no longer a way for it to be safe, help with the decision making afterwards. So the other benefit is if you go to a certified driving rehab specialist, it takes a lot of the pressure and the blame off of the family. It allows a person who specializes in helping this decision help your family and the rest of your medical team through the process. So all of my patients are very aware. I completely recommend seeing a certified driving rehab specialist as the safest choice. You can find the certified driving rehab specialist on the ADED website, which is a resource we have on the back of your handout. Each certified driving rehab specialist can be a little bit different in how they want their referral. Many of them around us require a prescription from a physician, which our HD clinic physicians are happy to provide. Mostly, it's an out-of-pocket cost. And this can be oftentimes the biggest barrier to helping our patients get there. At times, the clinical portion, the in-clinic testing, as opposed to the behind-the-wheel testing, may be covered by insurances, but it depends. And there's also some certified driving rehab specialists will only use their own vehicle. Some only want to do it with your vehicle because they realize that that's the vehicle you'll be driving. Some of them will require that the person being tested come to a clinic space and start there and then drive from there. Others will say, no, I'm going to come to you. There's even one near us that will drive 2 to 3 hours to your house to use your house and your roads and your car. And they will install, oftentimes, a specialty brake so that they have that mechanism. It depends. I have heard various stories, but I want you to know that there are variabilities, and these are some of the different ways that it is approached. The cost of a certified driving rehab specialist evaluation for the usually 3, sometimes up to 6 hours of evaluation is usually in the ballpark of about $300. The certified driving rehab specialist I was referring to, who has your car adjusted and goes to your house and your roads, sometimes can be in the neighborhood of more like $700 to $800. So if you're looking for a certified driving rehab specialist, you may want to shop around for what fits your expectations and your budget too. A certified driving rehab specialist evaluation includes they'll do a history, they'll do an in-clinic assessment, they'll do a behind-the-wheel evaluation, If appropriate, they do behind-the-wheel training. They will make recommendations if any vehicle adjustments need to be made, as well as the documentation and sharing that information like we were speaking about before. So what's part of the clinical evaluation? The clinical evaluation will do a thorough screening of visual abilities, including that vision perception that we talked about. It will do a full physical assessment, so range of motion, strength, but for our persons with HD, we're thinking more about their reaction time, their proprioception, their coordination, those types of things, and of course, reaction time. And a cognitive screening in the clinic. What are their cognitive abilities? And then to me, the big one, what is their level of self-awareness? Some people will have mild deficits, but they're very aware of their deficits, and so they're able to make adjustments appropriately in the moment. And then once they've done this clinical, then the certified driving rehab specialist will do the on-the-road. In the on-the-road, it's everything we would think it would be. It's, can they maintain their position in the seat? Can they interface with the the steering wheel, the buttons? Do they understand well how they're doing, how they're approaching, driving? Are they already using compensatory strategies like those modifications? What's their receptivity to using them? And how quickly do they fatigue? Pending the evaluation, the certified driving rehab specialist may do training, which would be how to help the person with HD implement modifications. And I have never had a patient with HD need physical adjustments to be able to drive their vehicle, but if there were any, the certified driving rehab specialist would make those recommendations at that point. So here's what the website looks like for finding a certified driving rehab specialist. You can plug in your location, and it'll pull up a list of the ones in your area, and it'll give some further details about how to connect with them. In our area, we do have a driving evaluation simulator, and I just want to speak to this briefly, because some certified driving rehab specialists will choose to use the simulator as after they do the clinical evaluation, maybe get in the simulator, try that, and then go do the on-the-road. There are some places that will use a simulator instead of doing on-the-road, and I just want to share a little bit about this. I think there's value to a simulator. I'm hesitant to saying that this should be the end-all, be-all for road safety for a person with HD, because I got in a simulator, the seat felt funny, I couldn't quite reach, and I did terribly. I am a typical adult, presumably. I didn't realize the black blobs were potholes and that I was losing points for hitting potholes. And quite frankly, for my people with HD, I don't care if you hit potholes. I just don't want you to hit other people or cars or harm yourself. So they're good. But if you were to ask me, I'd much rather you do an on-the-road, real-life evaluation. But I'm not saying the simulators don't have some value.
Do you find that when they use the simulators, especially people with HD, they translate that to real life?
Yeah.
Analyze it?
That was exactly the conversation. So she was asking about translating the experiences in the simulator to real life. And that was exactly the conversation a certified driving rehab specialist and I had recently, that there are enough differences in the sensory experience of it and what's being tested in it that it doesn't always do a good test of how they would actually do on the road. So the people that I work with that see our patients with HD that are certified driving rehab specialists, we're all in the same camp of the simulators are good, but we really want to do the real deal on the road. Okay, so I'm getting ready to wrap up this section. I recognize that families with HD sometimes don't have the funding to be able to afford a certified driving rehab specialist. It's the reality of some lives. And so at that point, we just need to really emphasize our communication, our collaboration, and support of one another as a medical team, as the family team, as a caregiving team, and highly, highly prioritize those ride-alongs. As I've said, I'm going to quickly say, to my people with HD, who do you trust, who do you respect to be able to give you feedback? If they say they're not going to respect feedback from their husband, then that's not the person that should be in the car. It should be someone, ideally, that they trust, respect, and they will receive that feedback from and do those monthly ride-alongs. If necessary, and if the state allows it, it may become appropriate to do the confidential reporting to the DMV.
So let's talk about emotions with driving. Driving is a part of our independence. So when you take away a piece of someone's independence, whether or not you have the best intentions, it's an emotional thing. I've never had someone jump up and down with great happiness when we've sat in the doctor's office and said, gee, I think it's time to retire from driving. There's a lot of anger. It's sometimes, like I said, you try to have conversations. Sometimes patients and people just don't want to talk about it. They are not going to consider it. I'm not going to stop driving, and they want to storm out of the doctor's office. They want to storm out of the room. Some people are very sad. It can cause, if somebody already has some depression, it can certainly make somebody more prone to a greater depression. It's all normal. We can't fix the emotions that go with it. People are entitled to their feelings, but we need to work through it, and we need to figure out how best to support the person. I said it at the beginning, I'll say it again. If you are the family member, the caregiver, the loved one, the care partner, you don't have to take the heat. Put it on us. Blame it on the medical professional, blame it on the chart, blame it on the driving evaluation. The nice thing about the driving evaluation is that you're giving very concrete facts. We know that with Huntington's disease, that somebody's insight or ability to see the problems is sometimes not there. And so while there may have been 5 accidents, or there may be a number of issues, that person says, I don't understand what the issue is. I can drive fine, there's no issue. Come back to the doctors, let us talk through it with you. If depression starts to get worse, talk to the doctors about medication. If the irritability and anger reaches a point that it's scary, again, talk to the physicians. One note on as far as, so when somebody refuses to retire from driving, this never happens, right?
No.
Everyone hands over their keys without a problem.
It does happen.
It does happen. It does happen. But oftentimes we see that it doesn't happen right away. Hopefully we've started these conversations early enough that somebody's not completely blindsided, but things that can happen when someone refuses to stop driving. There are the obvious safety implications. Could you get hurt in an accident? Could you hit somebody else? Could you hurt somebody else? Could you hurt one of your own loved ones? Right? We don't want that to happen. The legal implications. If you do hit somebody else or you do hurt somebody else. So every time you go to the doctors, whether or not you've brought up the subject when they're asking about driving, they bring up concerns, or if they tell you, we want you to have a driving evaluation, or you know what, based on everything, we just think it's time to stop driving. That goes in your medical record. That has legal implications if there's an accident. If you are reported to the DMV, they will oftentimes, depending on your state, ask the physicians to fill out a form or provide medical records. It's in your medical records. That can have financial implications also. You don't want your insurance company to find out you were driving when you were told not to. You don't want your insurance company to say, gosh, we're not going to cover this. You also then, after all that, don't want to be the person that's at fault for an accident that you shouldn't have been at fault for because it comes out that you shouldn't have been driving in the first place. It could.
Legal implications. If they take the tests and do all that, and they do really good, and that goes on their file, and you get in an accident, and people find out that the person driving had HD, does that help the person?
It
with
does.
HD?
It does, yes. So that's the other thing is that, so if somebody says, gosh, the person that was, that I hit, I know it was my fault, but it looked like there was something going on, I wanna know. And you can say, yeah, I do, I have a neurological condition, but I've been evaluated recently and determined that it's not a deterrent on my driving. So it can help you as well. But the big part is it affects you and your family, and it could cost more than you realize. Also, the emotional implications of simply, like, if you've hurt somebody else. So, again, it's all normal. There's not one right feeling to have. It's okay to be angry, it's okay to be sad. We ask families to watch for emotions that have gotten to extreme. Again, extreme depression. If somebody says, if I can't drive, I can't live anymore, then you need to call the doctor, you need to call 911, you need to go to the emergency room. If somebody's temper gets out of control, is volatile, you need to call 911, you need to get in a safe space. But the one other piece that I did not talk about yet is, so we talked about the doctors playing the bad guys, the medical professionals playing the bad guys. We can't physically take the keys away. That does go to the family. Do it, your loved one the best. Do it in the safest possible way. If you know it's going to be a fight, if you know it's going to be a safety issue, don't do it by yourself. Don't have the kids in the house. If you leave the second car at the house and take the keys and go to work, your house may get torn up looking for those keys. If you can remove the car, remove the car. We'll talk about that in just a little bit. But so what happens now? Who can help with resources? Hopefully before we've actually stopped driving, you've been talking to the doctors, to the medical professionals, to the social workers about the resources in your area. If you have an HDSA social worker, an HD social worker in your area, talk to them. Pretty much every county or state has some type of social service agency or agency on aging. They can tell you what's available through your county. Reach out to them. Community resources. Again, I'm spoiled. I live in a big city area, so we have buses and metro and things like that. I'm guessing where Shelley is, they don't have quite so accessible, and people in more rural areas.
When you get the driving evaluation done, do they give you the results right there or then, or do they mail it to you? I mean, that could be a long ride home if you get the results there and they didn't.
So the question was if you got the results right there after a driving evaluation. I believe they usually do. It's something as a family member that what you may want to do if you're concerned about that long drive home. By the way, we know it can be a long drive home from the doctor's office also after we've had this conversation. Yes. That may be something ahead of time that you want to talk to the certified driving rehab specialist and your loved one about it. That you're doing this, we don't know what they're going to say, but we do have to get in the car and drive home afterwards. If there's again, you've got to look at what are the safety implications of that and how to work around it.
That's one of the, I've been pretty open about my bias. That's why I love when it's a certified driving specialist, it's an OT, because as an OT, they are also a part of the conversation of how to do community accessibility. So if you know that your loved one has a fiery temper, please give people a heads up because we will work with you to try to approach things in as best manner possible so that you have as good of an experience as possible.
And then just to finish up, Uber, Lyft, taxis. One thing I find is that we know it's not cheap to get Ubers and taxis and things like that. What we find is that usually when you balance the cost of no longer having a car payment or car insurance or gas, it balances out a little bit. One of the things that I like to do and recommend to my families, the family members of our patients, before they come in, when we know that we're getting to that sort of final conversation about, okay, this is it, is I like to work with the family members ahead of time to say, what's the plan? And that way, when we finally give that final say, you know, where the driving eval hasn't gone well or there's just been too many accidents, then with the family, we can say, this is the plan for you to get to work, or this is the plan for you to get to Starbucks, or this is the plan for you to get to the next place. And that oftentimes helps, because in that moment, it's hard for the person to see how they're gonna get somewhere. So, after you retire from driving, now what? How do you talk to people about it? Do you need to talk to people about it? I had a gentleman once whose wife unfortunately totaled her car. She wasn't hurt, no one was hurt. It was very fortunate. She said to him, can I have a new car? I won't drive, but I want a new car, right? And he said, well, I don't understand. Well, I don't want the neighbors to know that I'm not driving. I don't think he bought her the new car. But it was a good indication of what her concern was about not driving. They were both retired. She wasn't worried about getting around. She was worried about how people were going to react. I think this is similar to also, how do you tell people, or do you want people to know that you're sick or that something's going on? Talk about that. Honey, you want me to tell our friends or neighbors? I know it's a concern for you. I can let them know if you think they need to know, and I can tell them it's sort of an off-the-limits conversation. Sometimes it's good to help get input. Again, then the next one, what happens to your car? Leaving it sitting in the driveway, sort of taunting the person or staring back, that's never really an effective thing. If it's a shared car with the family, it's a shared car, but then it's not sitting there, someone else is using it. I've had some times where there's a teenager that's getting ready to start driving, so they're trying to hold on to it for that person. If there's a family's house that it can go and be parked at, if you can sell it, it's great if you can sell it. I know CarMax is a national chain. I think they're in a lot of places. CarMax will buy your car from you without you having to purchase a car. They'll cut you a check that day. It's a good way to get rid of it. It's a good extra chunk of change. And then getting used to the new normal. I'll be honest, it's oftentimes a hard conversation, but eventually I see people do okay. They get used to it, they figure it out, they make the modification, and we come out on the other side. Public transportation safety, if you live where there's public transportation, there's ADA laws and compliances they have to follow. So there are some modifications. Work with your OT and your other providers to figure out how to make the modification. Some areas have specialty transportation through their public transportation. You can ask about that. Usually requires a letter or a form or something from the physician's office. We're happy to fill out those forms. You won't be the first one to ask us to do it. You won't be the last one.
So this is a very brief segue. If you have a family member who has HD that has advanced, and this is a person who's in the home but needs transportation to doctor's appointments or family activities, you can also go back to thinking that certified driving rehab specialists can help with figuring out a wheelchair accessible vehicle options. So we're not talking about the person with HD being the driver anymore, but as a passenger. So wheelchair accessible vehicles could have a lift or a ramp. They could be rear entry lift or ramp, or they could be side entry lift or ramp. There are also national mobility equipment dealers who have quality assurance programs to help families who have people with disabilities have a wheelchair accessible vehicle. Funding for that, there are some of the car companies, Toyota, Ford, will have a rebate options. Sometimes people will use charitable organizations to help with funding for a wheelchair accessible vehicle. Sometimes there are special finance programs, and sometimes people will do fundraising, GoFundMe, community fundraisers. So, keep in mind that you may want to loop back to that certified driving rehab specialist down the road if your loved one is staying in the home and needs a wheelchair accessible vehicle.
This is Sunny. She wants to remind you to practice safe driving. Sunny is not a safe driver, so she has retired from driving.
Thank you all for being here, and we'd love to answer any questions. We have about 5 to 10 minutes.
This is just a comment. She was probably more concerned about getting in and out of the garage, because that's a fairly narrow space. So she's going to the grocery store, going somewhere, the doctor's appointment. I back the car out, get it straight so she doesn't have to do all that. That's really helped her and gave her more confidence.
That's a wonderful example. So just for the folks watching online, the gentleman was saying that for his wife, the biggest concern with her was backing in and out of the garage. And so he would back the car in and out for her and get it on the road, and then she was okay to go off. That's a great example of just a really simple modification that keeps someone driving longer.
And something we commonly hear about. That's why we have that joke about the Huntington Steve's parking space at the end. Yeah. Yeah, exactly. Any other questions or comments?
I was going to ask, in your experience, how much of driving impairment is fundamental for driving training and skills, regardless of impairment, versus impairment?
So the question was how much of driving issues are fundamental.
They learn at 16 how to drive.
Yeah, bad drivers training at 16 versus impairments. It's generally probably more the impairments, I would say. I think, everyone has their bad days, or where they're not paying as much attention, or they maybe haven't gotten the same type of driving safety. But it's being able to compensate for those maybe poor training skills early on.
I think an example is like in the kitchen. How many times have you seen someone who just doesn't use the oven mitts? They're just going to use a towel, and they're always in the habit of doing that. Well, they can learn to use the oven mitts. That's a modification they can learn to do and would be beneficial to everyone. And I think that's where we're getting at, is when there are the very earliest signs, to make sure that, as our guest said, defensive driving, that they're already doing everything they should be doing, and that they are having supported, and if they didn't know it already, they need to know it now.
My biggest struggle is having very little ones, and having already an average of 1 or 2 accidents a year. It's hard, like all those warning signs, the watch and the actual warning. I can check mark next to every single one, but I don't know when to say when, because most days are great, or okay.
So that's not an uncommon thing. So what she was saying was that she's got 2 little ones. There have been a couple accidents, and she can check off the warning signs, but some days are okay. So that's when, so 2 things. The first is we will commonly start to say no driving with children in the car as one piece. The other piece, that's the perfect sort of segue to talk to the doctors. You don't have to be the one to say when. We don't want family members to feel like they're the ones that have to say when. That's why we have medical professionals. That's why we have driving evaluations. That's why we have those things, so that you're not having to play the guessing game, so that you can let a medical professional take everything in, make the proper evaluations, and then give the 2 of you the feedback to know what's next.
I would anticipate from what you're saying that most likely you have a loved one who can safely drive in certain conditions, but needs to have a firm indication from someone on what conditions are not safe. And I think that the certified driving rehab specialist type evaluation would probably be extremely beneficial for your loved one and give you a lot of peace of mind. And I come from a community that is not as affluent as some others. We're in Appalachia. If you've ever seen the movies about Appalachia, a lot of my patients come from Appalachia. And so funding is an issue. And so I want to speak to that of trying to remember how much you invest in car insurance, how much you invest in a car, how much maybe you spend on a flight to here. And think about, okay, $300 is a lot of money, but in the context of getting this evaluation and having that peace of mind and being a safe driver, it's probably worth it.
Do you see that the anxiety in taking a test like that plays into how well they do? Because with my sister, one of the first times was I drove with her on Christmas Eve, and I was, oh my gosh, I'm scared. But now she's on some meds, and actually I find her driving to be better.
Right.
Do you ever see that?
We do. So the question was if anxiety can cause problems driving or cause a problem on the driving test. So I mean, I think there's probably something to it. Now, again, if extreme anxiety or anxiety is going to cause a concern in driving in certain conditions or the test, that's going to be indicative. You use the example you said she's on medication, and that's
Focus to be better, but I don't know if it's also because she's been diagnosed and what she knows. This is all recent. So is she capable of paying more attention, but yet, or is it meds, or?
So extreme emotions can make you an unsafe driver. So it's very possible that if her anxiety was causing problems before, and it's now, it's now under control, that she is safer. Again, this goes back to having evaluations, talking to the physician about it. Probably, as Shelley recommended, somebody riding with her on a regular basis. But again, I think that's another example of a modification that can help, is if somebody's emotions are causing the problem, how do we work through that, and is there something we can do about that?
Yeah.
So we are, I think, a little bit over time. I know there's lunch in the award ceremony right now, so I don't want to keep people from that. If there are additional questions or other comments, Shelley and I can hang out for a few minutes and answer any questions. Thank you all so much for coming to our session. We know driving is a tough topic to talk about, so we appreciate you sitting through and